us now and listening in as well as our front office insider, Jim Bowden. Jim, anything surprising stand out to you with Rob saying what he said so far?
I mean, there were two things that really stood out to me. Number one, explaining the timing of the lockout. He referred back to 1994 when the owners did not lock out the players. They played the season until August, and then the players went on strike, and thus the clubs lost all of the postseason money where most of the revenue comes from teams. He said in that press conference they didn't want to make that same mistake twice. So that's why the timing was to lock them out as soon as the CBA expired, to take that possibility off the table. So he explained that. The other thing that really stood out to me was he mentioned that the players wanted $100 million of revenue sharing taken away. They wanted to reduce the revenue sharing by $100 million. He talked about how that would cripple the small markets. We're talking about cities like Pittsburgh as an example. It would be devastating for them. He also, in that press conference, Tommy, was very clear about what the union wanted to do, which was to reduce free agency from 6 years to 5 years. Again, the effect that would have on the smaller market teams. You get a young player, becomes a star, you only control him for 5 years instead of 6 years. That's something the clubs are not willing to do. He also talked about arbitration going from 3 years down to 2 years as well. Look, it's very clear, and he was very clear in this press conference, that it's the core of the economic issues. That is why this lockout has taken place. And basically, again, he reiterated, since May of last year, the union has not moved off their original proposals in any significant way in terms of the core economic issues, and that's why we have the lockout.
Let me bring in David Samson, our MLB analyst and former World Series champ, former president of the Marlins. David joining us now on CBS Sports HQ. Anything surprise or notable for you listening to Rob Manfred, David?
I think it's just very important to understand that this is very much a procedural thing that was done last night at 12:01 a.m. And while Rob wants you to believe that this was done because he believes it's the best way to get to a deal, what he's leaving out is this is the best way to get to the deal that the owners want and to give as little concessions, as few concessions as possible to the players. While it's true the players have not moved off their positions, it's also true that the only movement that the owners have done through this negotiating process has been movement that's been like blowing into a hard wind coming against your face. It doesn't matter. Every proposal the owners have made, they knew the players would reject outright. And every proposal the players have made, they knew the owners would reject outright. So all of this is just positioning in order to get to a deal. The biggest concern that nobody's talking about, and I spent today's Nothing Personal talking about this topic, the biggest concern is that during the pandemic, we learned that you can have a shortened season that, as long as you include October and the ability to have fans in the stands for every game of that shortened season, that is something that this sport can handle. And the only way to get to a final agreement is when two sides to a dispute feel as though they are up against a true deadline. And the true deadline in this case is not December 1st or January 1st or even February 1st or March 1st. That's the problem that we have going forward, is that the true deadline is probably not till June 1st.
Is that right, Jim? Seeing some manufactured deadlines, Rob Manfred mentioning some of that during his press conference today. What are you hearing about, as we near, of course, spring training and eventually a new season?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I want to point out is you're able to get through a pandemic, and the fans understood that, so the fans didn't go away when we had the truncated season. If there's no baseball until June, as David Samson brought up, I don't think baseball will be able to withstand it like they did the pandemic, because I think you'll lose a lot of fans. I was part of that 1994 strike situation in 94 and 95. I was the GM of the Reds. We were in first place both years. It was devastating to our sport, and it took years for the game to come back. This game cannot take a work stoppage of games come opening day without doing serious damage. So the part that I find unfortunate is there's no sense of urgency on either side. For the months of December and January, there's no reason for anyone to give a lot and to really make concessions significantly. It's when spring training starts and then opening day becomes a month away. That's when there'll become a little bit of pressure. But both sides are dug in. I mean, as David Sampson said there, and he's right, you talk about what the clubs have done. Okay, the clubs have said, we'll give you universal DH. We want expanded playoffs. They want 14 teams. The players want 12. Both of those things can be resolved. The clubs are willing to increase the minimum salary. The players want that as well, but the players want more money. The owners are willing to increase the tax threshold, but not as much as what the players want. So there has been some progress, but it's the core issues where there's been zero progress, and that's what's disappointing to me.
I want to ask both you guys this question here, and it's something Rob Manfred brought up between the free agency years, 6 to 5, or the $100 million. If I'm a casual baseball fan, asking if one is more important than the other, if I had to pin you on that, what would it be, David? And I'll have you start first.
Well, free agency is obviously a huge thing for the players, but let's talk about it from a player's standpoint. While they want free agency as soon as possible, I always said, and Jim, you may remember this when we were in the game together, I wanted free agency every year. How great would it be for players, I thought, and I would say this to Scott Boras, you want early free agency? My pleasure. Every year, every player's a free agent. Let's get rid of long-term deals and let's pay players for their actual performance. Obviously, that's extreme, but it was meant to say that you're claiming that you want early free agency, but what you really want is to guarantee that your majority of the union, the middle class and the younger players, are getting a bigger piece of the pie. And what baseball has responded with is, hey, look at all the $300 million contracts. Look at how healthy the game is by all the money that was spent in these last few days. And that's a red herring because the rank and file of the union is not interested in Max Scherzer or in Corey Seager. They are interested in the middle relievers, in the utility players, and I don't mean Chris Taylor because now those players are even getting $15 million. The guys who don't make it to free agency at all. How does this end? It ends with free agency not tied to an age because you can't take the benefit away from players who get called up early and would gain the ability to sign contracts at 26, 27, or 28. It will end with arbitration coming sooner and with the minimum salary getting higher, and that's where the common ground will be found. But the core economic issue that Jim is talking about, that the owners are not willing to move on, is allowing their GMs to do what they think is best in order to win rings. And sometimes it's best to rebuild. Sometimes it's best to know that you're not going to win and that your window is closed. And there is no way an employer is going to let an employee tell him, her, or them how to run their business. And that is the core economic issue, that there is no agreement, and I don't see an agreement anytime soon on that issue that Max Scherzer and Scott Boras have described as we want to eliminate, quote unquote, tanking.
So to answer your question, Tommy, it's really a big market, small market question, right? When you talk about taking free agency from 6 years to 5 years, I spent most of my life running small market teams. I needed to be able to control my young players for 6 years. If I control them for 5 years and they walk away to the big market teams, I lose that extra year. That's important to me. And by the way, in the present system, if I can't afford a player, I can non-tender the player in his final year of salary arbitration. But I wanted to have that choice. If I had a young player like Barry Larkin or Ryan Zimmerman, I want that right to control that sixth person. It was really important to me. In terms of revenue sharing, you have a lot of teams like David Sampson's Marlins or the Pittsburgh Pirates that depend on that revenue sharing. And it's going to be hard for them to survive without getting it. So really, when you look at the two things, if you're a small market team, you have to have both. Now, if you're asking me to represent the bigger market teams, the Yankees, the Red Sox, and the Phillies, I would be more open to having a trade-off here because I can win if there's earlier free agency. And if I don't have to share as much money and I can put that money, instead of sharing it with the smaller market clubs, if I can just put it into payroll, I even have more of an advantage to win. So they go hand in hand, but I don't think there's any doubt that the 30 owners together after all these years, do not want to give up that 6-year free agency. And the revenue sharing, quite frankly, has allowed a lot of teams to be more competitive. We got to see the Tampa Bay Rays this past year. They had the best record in the American League. We saw them the year before in the World Series. So we look at this system, and sure, there are parts that are broken. We talk about teams that are tanking like the Baltimore Orioles are doing right now. And they're doing it because the process worked for Washington and for the Cubs and for other teams. That's something we need to fix. So you can fix it with the draft. You don't have to tie draft pick compensation with free agency, and the clubs are willing to get rid of that. As an example, you need to fix a system and add lottery to the draft to help teams not tank. The owners are willing to do that as well. They've had proposals for both of those things. So look, there's a lot of issues here, but the problem we have right now is the Players Association, led by Tony Clark and their lead attorney, Bruce Meyer, who is a great negotiator. He is extremely tough. They're not moving, and they're going back to the Marvin Miller, Donald Fear days, where the negotiating style was my way or the highway. And basically, the commissioner's office and the 30 teams have said, okay, then take the highway. And that's where we are right now on the lockout highway.
All right. We had statements from both sides, and then this morning, hearing from Commissioner Rob Manfred, Jim Bowden, David Samson. Guys, thank you very much for the explanation and the insight into what we're dealing with in Major League Baseball. Nothing Personal with David Samson. Download and follow. David had mentioned talking about this very thing already on his podcast today, and you can be sure it'll be brought up many more times as these two guys continue and two sides continue to try to work things out.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.